As the war in Ukraine continues and the risk of global food shortages grow, the UN Secretary-General warns of an unprecedented wave of hunger and destitution if the crisis is not addressed. But can a looming food catastrophe be averted? Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. Russia and Ukraine supply nearly 30% of global wheat exports, as well as significant amounts of other commodities. How much of last year's crops still in storage and this year's crops yet to be harvested will reach global markets remains to be seen. Record rises in fuel prices have exacerbated the situation. The crisis is also made worse by climate change. Crop yields are falling globally, and there are more dire predictions. Already this year, extreme heat has severely damaged crops in India, another major exporter of wheat, leading the government to ban exports, which has caused further price hikes. One of the countries that have been most affected by the global food crisis is Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation and the world's second largest importer of wheat. We traveled to Nigeria to speak to farmers and consumers about the country's food crisis.
lórí ìjà Ukraine so ọ̀pọ̀lọpọ̀ nǹkan ò lọ bó ṣe yẹ kó lọ nítorí pé àwọn company tó ń ṣe flour náà àwọn náà ò rí wheat bó ṣe yẹ láti ìgbà tí ìjà Ukraine ti bẹ̀rẹ̀ so kíní yẹn flour yẹn ti lọ òkè gidi gan then sugar náà bẹ́ẹ̀ gbogbo ingredient tá ń lò gbogbo ẹ̀ náà ló ti lọ òkè.
Sakamakon abin da yasa muka samu takaitar ruwa na sama shekara mai da ta wuce mun samu takaitar ruwan sama rashin wadatar ruwan sama shi ya kawo mana rijiyoyinmu da muke tonawa na burtsatse suka kawo mun dasa alkamanmu lokacin mun shuka ta muna cikin bata ruwa to kawai sai wannan rijiyoyin sai ruwan su ya kafe gaba daya.
Búrẹ́dì ó ti di nǹkan tó jẹ́ pé kì í ṣe oníkálukú ló lè afford mọ́ torí pé búrẹ́dì tẹ́ rà ní 50 naira nígbà kan ó lè máa rà ní 100 naira àbí 120 ní ìsìn tẹ́lẹ̀ ẹ lè sáré yọ owó lé ọmọ lọ́wọ́ pé gbà lọ ra búrẹ́dì 50 naira so gbogbo ohun tí àwọn wò ní iṣẹ́ tí à ń ṣe tẹ́lẹ̀ à ń ṣe bóyá bí 17 bag 20 bag bọ̀ ní ìsìn gbogbo ohun tá à ń ṣe ojú bóyá 10 12 lọ torí pé mákẹ́ẹ̀tì yẹn ti fall.
Nigeria is not alone in its struggle to provide food for its citizens. Other African countries find themselves in a similar situation. Joining me now from Kenya is Professor Karuti Kanyinga of the Institute for Development Studies at the University of Nairobi. Professor Kanyinga, we just saw how the rise in global market prices for basic food commodities like wheat, like sugar or maize is affecting people in Nigeria. What is the government doing to mitigate that impact?
The Horn of Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, Djibouti, parts of Somaliland, if one can include them, is also experiencing food shortages of unprecedented nature compared with what we have had in the past. Now, one must also look at this in a broader context and say that this is not a new crisis. We have got climate change impact in the region, droughts, famine that have been recurring in the region, then combined with the whole issue of the current crisis that we have in the energy petroleum imports in the whole region, makes cost of living very, 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 very high for many people. When you look at the whole context of food shortages in the region, and in particular Somalia, the government of Somalia does not have the capacity to import food to subsidize households. None of the governments in the region has got that particular capacity. And given the fact that food production has not been at same levels as used to be the case a couple of years ago, when there wasn't a drought and a drought in the region, one can see where the governments really have difficulties in.
And yet many countries in the region are dependent on wheat imports. Just how disruptive has the war in Ukraine been to the food supply in Somalia and neighboring countries?
The war in Ukraine has disrupted the food chain, not only the food chain, but everything, all the imports in the region have really been impacted upon, especially because the cost of petroleum has gone up. The import of wheat itself has meant that many governments and many countries in the region do not have the necessary necessary imports that they have used in the past, as has been the case in the past. And given that many countries have been importing from Ukraine and even Russia, it means that we are really yet to see the end of the crisis. Now, what this has meant...
And this crisis is compounded by other issues as well, of course, facing many of these countries. High percentage of the population lives below the poverty line. There's unemployment, which is high, food insecurity, and acute malnutrition are common. There's also often the issue of corruption and mismanagement. I mean, how do you increase domestic production enough to mitigate the food shortage?
One thing we must put our fingers on is actually climate change in the region, and the fact that many governments in the region rely on rain-fed agriculture. They have not been able to diversify agriculture itself to have irrigation, even irrigated agriculture, even if there is potential for it. So that's one particular failure that we must put our fingers on. But we must also emphasize that there have been land grabs in many of the countries by international firms that have been producing food for export rather than food for domestic consumption. Although the impact of that is not as severe as the droughts and famine that we have, is a factor to consider as well. But I think we need also to underline the fact that intercommunal conflicts in the region have made agricultural production a very difficult thing in some of the countries in the region, and therefore making the cost of living, production of agricultural production a very difficult economic activity.
Do they have the capacity to increase their food production?
Some countries have got capacity to improve food production, but as I have said, the structural conditions in those countries make it extremely difficult to improve food production within a short period of time. And given those limitations, there is a need for international community to make interventions in countries like Somalia, countries like Ethiopia, parts of Ethiopia, parts of Djibouti. Those are areas those are countries that will require urgent emergency assistance.
And so in the meantime, how concerned should governments be? There are already signs of unrest in several countries. Is there a risk of social or political upheaval?
Of course, there is the risk of social disruption. There is risk of social unrest once the crisis and the cost of living gets to levels where the ordinary people, and especially in urban areas, when the inflation levels go to levels that the people in urban areas cannot be able to cope with, of course, there is the danger that people get into the streets. This has happened before in several countries. Sudan is a very good example. We have had such cases in Tunisia. We have had cases like that in different parts of the continent. High cost of living can lead to unrest, and we have seen it before.
What needs to happen at the systemic
more long-term,
level?
every government must develop very strong policies on agricultural production. Countries that are able to produce food for their own, this is the time to go beyond rain-fed agriculture and start thinking about large-scale agricultural investments and change policies that make agricultural production a very difficult undertaking. Taxes, for instance, for the private sector are a worrying concern for many private investors in the continent. There is also land grab. Now we have seen instances where many countries are coming to Africa and grabbing land and taking what we are calling land grab, where they plant food crops for export to their own countries. That's an issue that is worrying many people on the continent.
And what can governments do about this?
As I said, we cannot really generalize and say that every government can approach this in a general manner. Every condition matters. Every condition and situation will matter. Government must come with policies to guide on how food production needs to be undertaken, whether by international firms or international investors and the local firms. There must be sound policies to protect their own citizens from hunger.
But do they have the political will or even the wherewithal to do this?
It's the citizens that can force governments to have the political will. I mean, we are not in that situation of saying that we are a hopeless continent when it comes to political will. We have seen citizens forcing government to act. And I think citizens in Africa today are not the citizens of yesteryears. Many of them are forcing governments to do things that are difficult.
And Africa is the youngest continent and the fastest growing continent. How is this going to affect the younger generation?
And it's the younger generation that are telling African governments that they're doing things wrong. And it's the younger generation that is coming at every election time to stamp their authority on leaders and say things must change. And that's where the hope for the continent is. A younger population that is restless, a younger population that wants things to be done right and to be done right all the time. And I think the unrest that we are talking, the potential for unrest that we are talking about is going to come from this younger generation of African population. People who are very well educated, who are very aware, digitally connected, people who are very young population that is highly globalized, knows the causes of problems of the continent, knows the inefficiencies in the continent, and knows the solutions to them. They are holding their leaders to account. Africa is no longer that hopeless like yesteryears.
All right, Professor Karuti Kanyinga, great to have your perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Now, while governments and international organizations are engaged in diplomatic efforts to address the challenges facing the most food-insecure nations and their populations, several factors are at play. The conflict in Ukraine has had a major impact on the global grain and energy markets, causing a shortfall in food supplies and price hikes for basic food commodities. Russia and Ukraine supply 28% of globally traded wheat, 29% of the barley, 15% of the maize, and 75% of the sunflower. As many as 811 million people, that's about 10% of the world population, are struggling to find food, and 45 million are on the brink of starvation. According to the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, almost 50 countries depend on Russia or Ukraine or both for more than 30% of their wheat imports. For 26 of them, the figure is over 50%. The World Food Programme, which got 50% of its wheat from Ukraine last year, and on which more than 115 million people depend, estimates that the crisis could drive an additional 47 million people into acute hunger in 2022, from a pre-war baseline of 276 million to 323 million people worldwide. After steadily declining for a decade, world hunger has been on the rise since 2017. It worsened with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in early 2020. In its global humanitarian overview for 2022, The UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs predicts that the number of people who need life-saving humanitarian assistance could rise by 17% this year. More than 500 million people rely heavily on the import of wheat from Russia and Ukraine, which export almost 30% of the grain supply worldwide. Around 25 million tons of corn and wheat, equivalent to the annual consumption of the world's least developed countries, is trapped in Ukraine. So how much progress has been made in addressing the current crisis, and what still needs to be done? I'm now joined by the former executive director of the World Food Programme, Ertharin. She served as U.S. ambassador to the Food and Agriculture Organization, a UN agency that leads global efforts to fight hunger. She is the founder and CEO of Food Systems for the Future. Ambassador Cousin, you have been at the forefront of the global fight against hunger. The WFP, the World Food Programme, your former organization, says the world is now facing a global hunger crisis of unprecedented proportions, and that we are at a crossroads. How do you avert what is being described as a looming food catastrophe?
Well, we need to perform the work that is necessary, of course, to meet the immediate humanitarian needs of those who are acutely hungry. The WFP estimates that they need to feed an additional 20 million people in the Horn of Africa today because of higher food prices and the impact of climate in those areas. And the challenge is that with the Russian invasion into Ukraine, 50% of the food that WFP distributes, they purchase from Ukraine, which means that the cost of food for humanitarian response has doubled and moving towards triple. The WFP is suggesting that this year they will need some $23 billion to meet the food and assistance needs of those who are affected by this crisis.
As you say, the price WFP is paying for food is up 44% compared to 2019 levels. And that was before the Ukraine crisis. So just how do you realistically stop what is being described as this march to starvation?
First of all, let's recognize that this march did not begin with the Russian invasion into Ukraine. We were beginning to experience a high food price crisis and a food availability crisis as a result of COVID, the conflicts in particular in different areas, as well as climate. And then with the challenges with the Russian invasion and the removal of the Ukrainian grades from the global food system, that exacerbated the challenge. What we needed then is for smallholder farmers, the 500 million smallholder farmers across the globe who provide about 80% of the food that is consumed in the areas where they live and work. They cannot produce at the levels that is necessary to fill the gaps in the global food system because of the lack of access or the high cost of fertilizer.
And these are challenges that the entire world faces. When you accepted the nomination to head WFP 10 years ago, you supported the transition from food aid to food assistance. A lot of your work at the time focused on Africa and the Sahel region. What are the tools, though, that these countries need, and can they afford them?
When you asked me what's the difference between the challenges that the U.S. faces and the other parts of the world, many of the countries don't have the benefit of the fiscal health that the United States, and some 60% of the lowest income countries in the world today have fiscal constraints coming out of COVID, where their limited public dollars were used to address the health challenges of COVID, and now their coffers are bare. And it is imperative that the World Bank, the IMF, those multilateral institutions that were created to support the financial needs of countries during times of distress, that those emergency windows are opened in a way that will ensure that countries have access to capital to support the investment in their farmers, as well as the subsidies that are necessary for their most vulnerable populations.
But you know that there are always these strings attached when the IMF and other such organizations get involved. You once played, according to Hillary Clinton, a central role in designing and implementing America's food security policies. If you were advising any of these most affected countries, whether it's Nigeria, Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia, or any other country like this, what would your policy advice be?
My policy advice would be that they need to design the systems that are necessary for them to transparently support the investment in their smallholder farmers, to transparently support the direct delivery of cash and other support to their vulnerable populations, to ensure that the movement of capital from the international organizations will deliver the outcomes and the results that the capital, the asset owners, managers, the donor countries that invest in those institutions would need in order to move that capital without the types of constraints that you described, but with the flexibility that is necessary to ensure the quick responses that are required to avoid the challenges of a looming food crisis in any of these countries.
And the question is, will that happen given all the challenges that these countries face, whether they're self-imposed challenges to do with corruption or infrastructural problems? But by any measure, however you look at it, we are not on track, are we, to eradicating hunger, to achieving zero hunger, the UN Sustainable Development Goal number 2. In fact, according to the United Nations, if recent trends continue, then the number of people affected by hunger will surpass 800 million by 2030. Just a matter of 8 more years, 800 million. By 2050, there will be an additional 2 billion. And these estimates predate the pandemic and the Ukraine crisis. So just finally, are we able to change this reality? How do you create that fundamental change in the global food and agriculture system?
The United Nations hosted a food summit last year where 190 countries stood up pathways and announced pathways towards achieving the goal to the reduction of hunger and malnutrition. And those commitments were real. But the commitments are only as valuable as the investments that are made. We need to ensure that the country's commitments to performing the work that is necessary to support the agricultural food production, the food system development within the within environmental boundaries that supports the health of their populations as well as the global community, that supports the finances of smallholder farmers, that those actions do occur and occur in a timely manner.
But can it happen fast enough to mitigate all this?
Yes, it can. We are every day makes the delivering the outcomes within the time frames necessary more challenging. But I am confident, particularly as we're going into this G7 and the global leaders have moved food security from the agriculture agenda to the political agenda, that there's a recognition now of the importance of addressing this issue today and not waiting until we have a crisis. And so as long as we can begin to have conversations like you and I are sharing today across the globe to bring the kind of attention that is necessary to drive the public will so that this issue remains on the top of the political agenda, we can deliver the action in a timely manner to ensure that we can avoid the consequences of a looming food crisis, the consequences of more people going hungry.
The clock is ticking indeed. We'll see if there's enough political will to change the current realities. A former executive director of the World Food Programme, Ertharin, thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you for this opportunity.
As tens of millions of people across the world face an unprecedented food emergency this year, the international system faces yet another test. If the pandemic exposed the vulnerabilities of the global system and its safeguards, causing the deaths of at least 15 million people worldwide, some predict that today's food shortages could trigger the next major health crisis and the death of millions more. How quickly governments can act to mitigate the effects of the global food crisis to avert another major catastrophe that will affect wealthy and poor nations alike, although not in equal measure, will be the next major test for the international system and the existing world order. That's all from me, Ertharin, and the team. Thanks for watching. See you next time.